Have you ever thought what it's like for a tutor to answer an SQE1 question against the clock? If so, keep watching, because I'm about to do it. Deep breath. 3, 2, 1, go. By his will, a testator, T, appointed, who did he appoint? His spouse. So let's go write that, spouse, his friend and adult son to be his executors. So let's get the three of them down on the diagram here. So we've got the spouse, let's write his friend and his adult son to be executors. So all would seem to be competent to be executors at this stage, just in case that's a competency question. Testator and his wife divorced after the will was executed. Right, she can't be the executor because he died after the divorce. That's interesting. Testator has now died. Okay, the son predeceased the testator, so he can't be the executor because he's already dead. And a grant of probate is issued to the son's estate, to the nephew. Okay. What else do we know? The testator left all of his estate to his niece, who's 20 years of age, so she's of majority, so there's no minor interest here, so we wouldn't need two executors at all here, and she's the sole beneficiary, so no minor interest. So the question is, who's got the best right to apply for a grant of rep? Well, testator's ex-spouse is in A. We've ruled her out, so we can rule A out completely because she's disqualified. B, the friend, yes, but the testator's niece only. She doesn't need to be. We only need one executor here. C, we can rule that out as well. The friend, yes, but the nephew's son and the testator's niece, there's no need for either of them to apply. There's no chain of representation here for the testator's son. Testator's friend only looks like the right answer, but E, the friend and the nephew, no. The nephew, no. The friend, yes. So definitely D is the right answer. SQETV. So, you've just seen me complete question 5 of the SRA's FLK2 sample questions in real time. I managed to answer the question in less than 102 seconds, which is the average time you have across SQE1 for each MCQ. And there was a lot going through my head as I processed this particular scenario, the question, and each of the 5 options. So what I'm going to do now is to explain my internal monologue at a slower pace so it's easier to follow my train of thought and how I got to the right answer. And by the way, yes, I've checked the SRA's website and option D was the correct answer. Now, if you've not seen one of these videos before, what we do now is to split the screen between the question and the real-time video of the whiteboard to show how I made my notes. And as I've mentioned before, whilst you can't use a pen or a paper in the exam, you do get given an erasable whiteboard in the SQE1 assessment, so I suggest that you invest in one now to practice how you'll use it in the actual exam, and it'll help you in your preparation. Now, because of my explanation taking longer than I did in the question, you'll see the video of the whiteboard pause from time to time so you can focus on what I was thinking at a more leisurely pace. So, here's the question again. I can see immediately from the first line of this question that it's all about wills and administration of estates. And I can also see that there's a large number of parties involved, so I think quite early on it's useful to sketch out who is who on the erasable whiteboard. And I can see there are 3 named executors. Firstly, the testator's spouse, secondly, his friend, and thirdly, his adult son. All pretty straightforward so far, but I'm expecting additional information to make the fact pattern a little bit more complicated. In the next part of the question, it tells me that the testator and his wife divorced after the will was executed. And as the testator has now died, this prompted me to remember that this would mean the wife's appointment as executor is no longer valid because they divorced before his death, but after the will was executed. The next part of the question tells me that the testator's son predeceased him and that the son's nephew has obtained the grant of probate of the son. This information really validates why it's a good idea to reduce the facts to a simple diagram, because we've now got 2 deaths and 2 probates going on. And at this stage I'm thinking there's no chain of representation issue here. Why? Well, that's because normally if there's a chain of representation issue, it means that a executor, whilst in post, after having been appointed and after the testator in question has died, takes up the post of executor and subsequently dies before the administration of the estate is actually completed. But that's not happening here because on these facts, the son predeceased the testator and therefore was not in post as our testator's executor at the time of T's death. So there should be no issue, I don't think, in terms of the nephew of the son becoming an executor of the testator's estate. The final piece of information that I can see is that the entire estate is left to the testator's niece, who is 20. And if you're given an age, folks, in the exam, do look at that carefully because it often means something. All I can make out at the moment is that she's 20, she's over the age of majority, and therefore there isn't any minority interest so far as I can see because she's the sole beneficiary. So on to the actual question, but before we do, just to reflect on how I analysed what I did as I was reading through the question. Remember, we're using the R technique, breaking up each part of the question into bite-sized chunks, reading those parts and then reviewing it as we go along. And then I've really got my head around quite a lot of the facts now and quite a lot of the issues. So what was the question asking? Well, it was asking who has the best right to apply for a grant of representation. And you should remember from your preparation that the starting point should be, well, who has the testator appointed in his will? And in this case, there were 3 named executors, and the starting point would be that they would all have the equal right to apply unless there was a good reason to rule them out. For example, if one of them was under the age of 18, but that's not suggested in the facts. But as we've already discussed, by applying the R technique and examining in bite-sized chunks each part of the question as we go along, we've done a lot of the consideration of this before we even get to the options. And it therefore made it easy to rule some people in and some people out. So option A became very easy to dismiss. Now, whilst the friend could be an executor, and in fact a quick glance of all the options in this MCQ shows that the friend is in all of them, the spouse couldn't be the executor because the divorce took place before the death of the testator. And we've also ruled out in our discussions earlier the nephew of the son, because he would only come into the picture by way of a chain of representation had the son survived his father, which he did not. So option A was easy to dismiss on 2 grounds. Option B was suggesting that the persons with the best right to apply for a grant were jointly the friend and the testator's niece. Remember, the testator's niece was the sole beneficiary of the estate. We've observed on the facts that she's over 18 and therefore, in theory, if she was entitled and had the best right to apply for a grant, she is of sufficient age to do so. But does she have the best right to apply for a grant? Well, on the facts, it's clearly no, because there is already a validly appointed executor in the will, which is the friend. There's no requirement for a second person to apply for the grant here. There's no minor interest, and therefore we can rule out the testator's niece. Option C was easy to rule out as well, as we'd already dismissed options A and B, ruling out the nephew of the son and the testator's niece. I was very relieved to see option D sitting there for me because I'd already ruled out most of the other parties and had concluded that on these facts there was no need for more than one party to obtain the grant, and therefore as the only surviving executor who was entitled to apply for the grant of probate, I was quite comfortable to select option D, but it would be wrong to make that final selection before we'd ruled out option E. Bad technique. Just to move on after reading option D, you need to check every option just in case option E was a better answer, but it wasn't. I quickly saw that we could already rule out the nephew of the son for the reasons we mentioned earlier. So yeah, I was pretty confident by selecting D that I got the right answer. This wasn't a case where we needed more than one person to apply for the grant. SQETV. Before we finish this video, let's just look at the what-if scenarios. These are to help you go away and consolidate the areas that are covered, but also consider other questions that might flow from very similar fact patterns. So what if the testator and his wife had been separated rather than divorced at his death? What if the son had survived the testator but died before he applied for the grant? And what if the sole beneficiary had been a minor rather than aged 20? These are all things that you should go back and have a look at your notes and consider how the fact pattern might affect the outcome of who would be the best people to apply for the grant. We don't give the answers here, but it's to help you consolidate your understanding. And just to remind you what the key topics which were covered by the SRA's FLK sample question 5, these were the appointment of executors in a will, how divorce affects appointments, death of an executor named in the will, and the number of persons required to apply for a grant. These are all important subjects you need to make sure that you've got a strong grip of when you go into the FLK2 part of the SQE1 assessment.
SQETV.
So that's now the end of this episode on SQETV. I hope you've enjoyed it. There's loads more videos just like this one covering sample MCQs that the SRA have published to look at the technique that's involved, but also look behind the questions and try and get to the answer as quickly as possible by using what we call the R technique. Remember, no pirates, just R. So there we go. If you want to like this channel, please do so. We love it when you do. Subscribe to the channel, and so that you get access to our videos as soon as they drop, please do tap the notification bell you can see on the screen now. Just remains me to say thank you so much for watching. Please do tune in to SQETV this time next week. Until next time, cue the jingle.
If you wanna be solicitors, why don't you